Okay, let's unpack this stack of sources on the concept of development.
Right.
This is going to be, I think, a really fascinating deep dive. We're
Definitely.
looking at where the idea came from, the different ways people have thought about how societies change, how they improve, and, some of the big debates that have shaped global discussions for decades now.
Absolutely. And we have some really rich material here. It pulls from various scholars who've really grappled with this complex idea. It's far from simple.
No, not at all.
And the sources you've provided, they definitely reflect that depth and, well, the many angles from which development can be viewed.
That's exactly what we love to explore here.
Hmm.
So our mission today is to take this material, these articles, this research, all these ideas, and really try to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge for you.
Hmm.
Think of us as your guides, maybe, helping you navigate these diverse perspectives on what development truly means, why some countries even came to be labeled developing.
Right, that whole terminology.
Exactly. And the very different paths that have been proposed, sometimes even, imposed for societies trying to move forward. Get ready for some surprising facts, maybe a few frustrating points about just how complex this all is.
Oh, definitely complex.
And hopefully some genuine aha moments along the way.
We'll be pulling insights directly from the source material, yeah.
Yeah.
Looking at the history, the theories, the practical challenges discussed.
All right, let's jump right in then. Really dig into this.
Here we go.
So right off the bat, if we're talking about development, we have to ask, what is this concept? The one we throw around so often.
Yeah, good question.
The sources take us back, explaining that the modern concept of development, particularly as it was applied globally, mostly in the latter half of the 20th century, it really evolved within the sphere of social sciences.
Hmm.
And critically, it seems it was specifically crafted, or at least intended, for the guidance of those, numerous new nations gaining independence after World War II. So 1939-45 onwards.
That context is absolutely vital. You're right. It wasn't just some abstract academic idea floating around.
Nope.
It was meant to be a practical concept, intended to guide states emerging from colonial rule into, well, a new global order. But the sources are also clear that while the modern concept evolved then, the idea of societal change and improvement wasn't entirely new.
Oh,
Early indications were present in social thought way back, 19th, early 20th centuries, often linked to broader theories of social change.
so the roots are deeper then. How was social change conceived back then, according to these sources?
Well, it was frequently viewed through a lens of inherent progression, a transition maybe from simpler forms of society to more complex ones,
Okay.
or from less efficient systems to those seen as more efficient. It was often framed as moving from what was considered ordinary to what was perceived as, well, better forms. Think of those evolutionary social theories.
Right, like society's climbing a ladder.
Yeah.
That sort of linear idea of progress.
Exactly. And development, as defined in this specific context by the source, it sort of builds on this. It identifies it as a process where a system or an institution undergoes transformation.
Okay, transformation towards what?
The goal of this transformation, according to the definition, is to become stronger, more organized, more efficient, and ultimately more effective. And the measure of success, that it proves more satisfying in terms of human wants and aspirations.
Okay, so it's about a deliberate process aimed at improving capacity and meeting human needs more effectively.
Precisely. And the sources offer us a couple of specific definitions that really capture different facets of this. There's J.H. Middleman, writing in 1988. He defined development as the increasing capacity to make rational use of natural and human resources for social ends.
It's a very pragmatic definition. It links resources, the physical stuff, and the people directly to achieving societal goals through rational action. It implies agency, right? The ability to plan and implement for collective benefit.
Yeah, agency is key there. And then there's Paul Barron from 1957, who saw it more broadly. For him, it was a far-reaching transformation of society's economic, social, and political structure.
Okay, a total
The
transformation.
production, distribution, and consumption. But Barron added a really crucial point, one that immediately introduces complexity. He said this process has never been a smooth, harmonious one.
That's significant. It acknowledges the inherent friction, isn't it? The resistance, the conflict that transformation inevitably brings. It's not just technical, it's deeply social and political.
Precisely. And Walter Rodney, in 1974, he added another layer, called development a many-sided process, but he focused specifically on the individual within that process.
Huh, interesting. What did he say about the individual?
For the individual, Rodney argued, development implies increased skill and capacity, greater freedom, creativity, self-discipline, responsibility, and material well-being. That brings a very humanistic perspective, doesn't it?
It really does. Seeing development not just as system change, but as individual flourishing, that's a powerful counterpoint to purely economic definitions.
Really?
So synthesizing these perspectives from the source, the core idea maybe boils down to people making the best possible use of their resources, natural and human, to achieve societal goals. That's development.
Mm-hmm.
And conversely, factors that hinder this effort, whether internal or external, that's what contributes to underdevelopment.
That simplified core is a useful starting point, I think. But, it immediately raises complex questions like what constitutes best use? Whose social ends are we talking about? And which factors are hindering progress and why? It opens up a lot.
Now, here's where the sources make a crucial distinction, one that often gets blurred in everyday conversation: the difference between development and progress. The source emphasizes that development is subject to measurement on an empirical scale.
Yes, this is key. You can, quantify development indicators, think GDP per capita, literacy rates, life expectancy.
Infant mortality, access to clean water.
Exactly, things you can gather data on and measure objectively, or at least with empirical methods.
Progress, on the other hand, is presented as being concerned with moral judgment. It applies a normative criterion.
Right. Progress asks, is society moving towards something better in a moral or ethical sense? This involves value judgments. For instance, a society might have rapid economic development, quantifiable growth, but if that growth comes at the cost of extreme inequality or maybe environmental destruction or eroding human rights,
Then it's not progress.
well, many would argue it doesn't constitute progress according to their moral framework, even if the numbers look good.
Why is making this distinction so important when we're analyzing societies and talking about global change?
It matters because it forces us to look beyond just the simple, quantifiable metrics. Just because a country's GDP is rising doesn't automatically mean its people are experiencing genuine progress. It pushes us to ask who benefits from development. What are the social and environmental costs? Do the changes align with broader human values?
Yeah.
The source really underlines that development implies a conscious effort towards a specific, identified goal.
So it's not just change happening organically. It's directed, planned, intended change.
Exactly. And the level of development is then described by how far a society is perceived to be from that consciously identified goal. It frames development as a journey towards a desired state, but, crucially, one where the destination itself is a matter of definition and value judgment.
That foundational understanding of what development is and isn't is crucial. With that in mind, let's turn to a term that's just deeply embedded in the history of this concept, particularly in the context the sources describe, the Third World. Who exactly are we talking about when we use this term, or, the related terms, developing countries or developing nations?
According to the sources, these terms were primarily applied to countries located in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They were initially characterized by, two key features. First, a generally low level of economic and political development when compared to the industrially advanced nations.
And the source identifies those advanced nations as the First World, Western Europe, the U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand, that bloc.
Correct. And the second characteristic for the Third World was a tendency, or maybe an aspiration, to remain free from the dominant influence of both that capitalist First World bloc and the communist Second World bloc.
The former USSR, Eastern European socialist countries.
That's Second World.
Of course, the Second World is a political bloc. It dissolved by 1991.
Yes, and the source is clear that this technically makes the term Third World outdated. However, it notes that the term persists in common usage, just due to its long history and perhaps the shared experiences it represents for many of these nations.
It's like a historical shorthand that's just
Yeah.
proven hard to shake. Let's look at the history a bit more. The sources mention Asia and Africa gaining independence after WWII from colonial domination, which makes sense in the context of guiding new nations. But Latin America, they achieved formal independence much earlier, right? First half of the 19th century. Why were they still grouped into this Third World category in the mid-20th century?
That's a really important point the sources highlight. Despite achieving political independence much earlier, Latin American countries, for the most part, remained significantly underdeveloped well into the mid-20th century.
Why was that?
The sources attribute this largely to their continued economic dependence, particularly on the United States. So, even without direct colonial rule, you had these structures of economic power that maintained a kind of subordinate relationship, hindering autonomous development.
So that shows underdevelopment wasn't solely defined by lack of political independence from European powers. The sources also point out that the term third world isn't perfectly precise or, uniformly defined.
That's right. And you can see this in the exceptions. Some less developed European countries, for instance, were typically not included in this category.
Why not?
The source suggests this is because they didn't actively challenge or position themselves outside the hegemony, the dominance, of the first or second world blocs in the same way the non-aligned nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America tried to.
So it was as much about political alignment during the Cold War, kind of, as it was about economic indicators. The sources discuss how, in international politics, these third world countries often pursued a policy of non-alignment, consciously refusing to join the military alliances dominated by the superpowers. India is cited as a prominent example.
Yeah, the non-aligned movement. And this policy wasn't about forming a single unified bloc against the first and second worlds, but rather about maintaining autonomy and seeking close coordination among themselves.
Okay.
The purpose of this coordination was really twofold: to foster mutual cooperation, often referred to as South-South cooperation, and to collectively raise a voice against domination and exploitation by the advanced nations.
And the sources underscore the potential power inherent in this group. Despite facing tremendous development challenges, they represent the vast majority of the world's population and states. The material suggests that if they could act in unison, their collective opinion, their actions, could play a decisive role in world politics, despite their economic constraints compared to wealthier nations.
Which brings us to the very origin of the term Third World. The sources trace it back to a French economist and demographer, Alfred Sauvy. He used it in a 1952 article.
And he famously drew that historical parallel to the French Revolution's Third Estate.
Yes, a powerful analogy. Before the French Revolution, you had the three estates.
Yeah.
Clergy first, nobility second, and the commoners third.
The vast majority.
Exactly. Numerous, excluded from power and privilege, yet perceived as holding immense potential for revolutionary change. Sauvy saw a parallel with the nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Numerous, largely excluded from the established global power structures dominated by the first and second worlds, but with a similar underlying potential for transformative action.
There's also another interpretation mentioned in the sources, isn't there? The third world, as representing a third distinct social and economic system, an alternative path to both capitalism and socialism.
That interpretation definitely gained traction as these nations navigated their options post-independence. It reflected a desire to forge unique development models, not beholden to either Cold War superpower ideology. The sources note this category now includes over 120 countries, comprising, about 3/4 of the global population, making their collective voice, despite resource limitations, internationally significant.
While there's obvious diversity among these countries, different histories, cultures, political systems, the sources do identify some common characteristics, things that have historically defined them and continue to pose challenges.
The most prominent is that shared colonial past. This history instilled a deep-seated resentment against former colonial powers and imperialism in general. For Asian and African nations, formal independence was relatively recent, often within living memory in the mid-20th century. For Latin American nations, while they achieved formal independence earlier, the resentment is often directed towards the perceived imperialistic policies and economic dominance of the United States.
And that history of exploitation, the drainage of resources during colonial rule, it directly contributed to the second common characteristic, a generally low level of development compared to industrialized nations. The sources list several specific indicators that were widespread.
Yeah, things like low per capita income, limited distribution, and access to technology.
A predominantly rural society, often 80–85% living in rural areas.
Very small manufacturing sector. Mass illiteracy, frequently above 50%. Limited educational opportunities, but paradoxically, often high educated unemployment.
Right.
Low nutrition, inadequate health facilities, high birth rates leading to concerns about population explosion, and limited social mobility. It's a long list.
It paints a stark picture of the challenges these nations inherited. A third characteristic identified is elite domination.
Politics, bureaucracy, business sectors were, and often still are, heavily influenced, controlled even, by a small, educated elite. The sources note this elite was frequently Western educated.
creating a disconnect.
Yeah, creating a disconnect and leaving the vast majority of the population with little real power to influence national policy.
And finally, political instability is highlighted as a common trait. The sources observe that a significant number of these countries have experienced repeated instances of constitutional governments being overthrown, often by military dictatorships.
These characteristics, while obviously not universally true for every single country in the category, they describe the general landscape. The common challenges shared by the nations categorized as the Third World within the sources framework. They underscore the profound structural disadvantages and internal complexities these nations faced as they embarked on the journey of development post-independence.
Okay, so these developing countries inherited economies and societies profoundly shaped by, well, intense exploitation during colonial rule. This sets the stage for what the sources call the Great Debates.
Yeah.
How do you move from this state of underdevelopment to development?
Right. The big question.
The material presents two major, often conflicting views that have dominated this discussion, the liberal and the Marxist perspectives.
And these two schools of thought, they offer not just different prescriptions for development, but fundamentally different explanations for why underdevelopment exists in the first place. Their views on history, economics, power, they diverge dramatically.
Let's start with the liberal view then. The source says this broadly represents the stand taken by many Western writers and policymakers.
Yes. The core postulate here is that all societies, regardless of their current state, essentially follow a similar trajectory, or a series of stages of development. This journey takes them from what's described as a primitive, traditional, or pre-modern society towards eventually becoming a modern, industrialized one.
And the underlying assumption is that modern systems are inherently more efficient. Is that it?
Exactly. More efficient at organizing society, producing wealth, solving state and societal problems. It's seen as analogous to the shift from, say, non-mechanized agriculture to a modern industrial system, a clear leap in efficiency.
The sources contrast the traditional government's role, limited mainly to collecting taxes, law and order, defense, with the modern government's role, which takes on an active responsibility for improving quality of life in addition to those basic functions.
And the relationship between the government and the governed shifts too. In traditional systems, people are often passive subjects. Government power is exercised over them. In modern systems, people or citizens are expected to be closely associated with the political process, communicating demands, opinions, expressing support or opposition.
Yeah.
The source highlights that the modern government relies on legitimacy derived from the consent or participation of the governed to secure support and cooperation.
And liberal models place significant emphasis on a process called differentiation. What does that entail?
Differentiation refers to the increasing specialization of roles and the clearer division of labor within society and its institutions. It involves the separation of different spheres, for instance, occupational roles becoming distinct from kinship ties, legal norms separate from religious doctrine, administration distinct from politics.
I see.
And importantly, it includes developing new processes and institutions specifically designed to accommodate these increasingly complex specialized roles.
So the political and social model they largely project as the goal.
Yeah.
It's essentially Western liberal democracy.
Precisely. The sources point to both earlier theorists like James Bryce and Carl Friedrich, and more contemporary ones like Almond and Coleman, Almond and Powell, Lucian Pye. They analyze political development largely through the lens of moving towards the structures and norms of Western liberal democratic systems.
The strong implication presented in the sources is that new nations must develop their political structures, their economy, their social organization in conformity with these Western patterns if they want to avoid remaining backward.
And economically, this perspective strongly suggests the path involves keeping economies open to free trade, international competition, relying primarily on a market economy structure for growth and development. The idea is that integration into the global capitalist system under market principles is the engine of progress.
Okay, that's a clear picture of the liberal path. Stages of growth, modernization as westernization, emphasis on efficiency, market economies, liberal democracy. Now, the Marxist view, according to the sources, takes a fundamentally different stance.
It proposes a path that is essentially one of well, confrontation with the capitalist world rather than following its example. The starting point for many Marxist analyses of underdevelopment is V.I. Lenin's theory of imperialism from 1916.
Lenin's argument being that advanced capitalism requires and facilitates the international exploitation of underdeveloped countries. That was the core of it.
Yes, he saw imperialism not just as political, but as the highest stage of capitalism, driven by the need for new markets, raw materials, investment opportunities. From this, he famously exhorted the underdeveloped countries to see themselves as the international proletariat, essentially, and to engage in a struggle against capitalism, initially taking the form of fighting for independence from colonial domination.
But when it came to post-independence development, Marxist and particularly neo-Marxist writers argued that simply adopting the capitalist path wouldn't work for these new nations. The situation was fundamentally different from when Western countries developed.
This is where Paul Barron's 1957 work is highlighted. Barron argued that advanced capitalist countries, they were able to accumulate the capital needed for their industrial revolution largely by exploiting their colonial territories.
Okay.
Present-day developing countries, lacking access to such external resources, face a different constraint. Furthermore, he argued their native capitalists were often too weak or perhaps too integrated into the exploitative international system to effectively develop productive forces within their own countries. Therefore, the capitalist path wouldn't lead to genuine progress for them.
And Andre G. Frank built on this significantly with his work, particularly on Latin America in the 1960s.
Frank developed what's known as the center-periphery model. He saw the world capitalist system as structured by a relationship between the dominant metropolis, the developed, often former colonial powers, and the subordinate periphery, the developing countries.
Right.
His crucial argument, supported by scholars like Walter Rodney for Africa, B. Cummings for Asia, was that the development of the center actually causes the corresponding underdevelopment of the periphery. They aren't independent processes, they're intrinsically linked within the global capitalist system.
And critically, this exploitative relationship, this dynamic of the center causing underdevelopment in the periphery, it continued even after the satellites, the peripheral countries, gained political independence.
Exactly. Frank's radical suggestion, therefore, was that to break this cycle of underdevelopment, the new nations of the periphery needed to delink themselves from the capitalist economies of the center. This was a direct challenge to the liberal view advocating integration. Samir Amin further confirmed this dynamic for Africa, arguing the very integration of industrialized and less developed countries into the same capitalist system inhibits the development of productive forces in the latter.
This body of work formed the basis of what the source calls dependency theory.
Yes. The central argument of dependency theory is that third world countries remain underdeveloped, primarily because their social and economic development was, and continues to be, conditioned by external forces. Specifically, the structure and needs of the global capitalist system dominated by the developed nations. Historically, their status as colonies.
Right, the looting and plunder.
Exactly. That caused the initial underdevelopment. The industrial growth and wealth of the First World are seen as being secured, to a significant extent, by exploiting the resources, labor, and markets of the Third World.
And this exploitation didn't just end with colonialism. It continued through mechanisms like unequal exchange in international trade, which the source points out is a departure from how conventional Marxism typically analyzes exploitation within a society.
That's a key nuance. While Marx focused on exploiting labor within a capitalist economy through forces and relations of production, dependency theorists extended this concept to the international sphere. The source defines unequal exchange as the theory that in international trade between developed and developing countries, the developed countries effectively receive a higher value for the labor embedded in their exports compared to what developing countries receive for the labor in theirs.
And why does this happen? According to the theory, what's the mechanism?
It's attributed to factors like superior technology and large-scale production in developed countries versus, well, inferior technology and smaller-scale production in developing countries. This structural difference allows developed countries to extract more value, perpetuating the cycle of dependency and hindering the developing countries' ability to accumulate capital and industrialize independently.
So the core tenet of this neo-Marxist perspective is that underdevelopment isn't simply a temporary earlier stage that every country goes through on the way to capitalism. Instead, it's a condition, a direct consequence of being integrated into and dominated by the capitalist world system.
Right. And advanced industrial societies are seen as not just incidentally more developed, but actively responsible for the underdevelopment of the periphery. This perspective highlights how, under present global economic conditions, underdeveloped societies are often economically dependent on exporting primary products, raw materials, agricultural goods.
And the markets for these products are largely controlled by the demand and power structures of the capitalist economies, leaving the producing countries vulnerable, to price fluctuations, external pressures,
Yeah, yeah.
far beyond their control.
hmm And advanced countries continue to invest in former colonies, but the sources argue this often serves primarily to secure access to cheap raw materials and labor and to create markets for their manufactured goods sold at market prices. They are, in effect, reaping profits without the direct political costs and administrative burdens of formal colonialism.
Right. So, from this viewpoint, the liberal solution suggesting developing countries should just link their economies more closely with advanced nations. It's seen as an illusion.
Pretty much. Neo-Marxists argue this only serves to further benefit the rich countries, deepen dependency, and widen the global gap.
So the Marxist suggestion for action, drawing on this analysis, is for suppliers of raw materials to exert collective power. The sources mention forming cartels to fix a just price for their commodities as a way to counter exploitation through unequal exchange.
Huh?
OPEC is given as a concrete example.
Yes, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. A cartel formed by developing nations to try and influence global market prices for oil. This debate between the liberal and Marxist views, stages of growth and integration versus dependency and delinking it, has profoundly shaped discussions and policies related to development for decades.
It really highlights the conflicting analyses of history and global power dynamics. However, the source's conclusion suggests that while dependency theory offers important insights into neo-colonial exploitation, it's not the only problem these nations face.
That's an important nuance. Underdevelopment isn't solely a product of external forces. The sources point out there are many other significant social, economic, political problems within these nations that need answers, that need concerted effort.
This is where the sources mention the importance of a concerted approach among developing countries themselves, like South-South cooperation, to address shared challenges and build collective strength independent of that traditional North-South relationship.
A significant challenge mentioned is technology. Developing countries often need to depend on advanced countries for modern tech. However, the sources raise a critical question about the suitability of Western technology. It's often developed for affluent societies, highly motivated, relatively small populations.
Can it be adopted wholesale for the conditions of the third world poverty, large populations, sometimes different social structures, maybe levels of apathy?
Exactly. The suggested solution in the source isn't outright rejection, but a careful combination. Borrowing necessary technologies, but creatively integrating and modifying them with indigenous technologies. The goal is to meet the specific requirements of their teeming millions, emphasizing solutions that ensure employment rather than displacing labor, which aligns with the reality of their large workforces.
The source also delves into the question of social values, contrasting the, cutthroat competition prevalent in the West with the remnants of communitarianism in many third world cultures.
Right. While a modicum of competitive spirit might be necessary for motivation, efficiency perhaps, the sources caution against adopting Western competition wholesale if it risks eroding that social solidarity, that compassion, that have historically been sources of resilience even amidst material poverty.
Welfare programs are deemed indispensable in third world countries, given the widespread poverty and historical traditions of mutual support, which urbanization has often eroded, leaving the state as the necessary safety net. But the source includes a stern caution. These programs need careful design.
Yes, they must be designed to genuinely support human resource development, nurture talent. The risk is that poorly designed programs can generate vested interests among the, incompetent or indolent, creating a disincentive for the competent and hardworking, ultimately hindering productivity and progress. It highlights a very delicate balance needed in social policy.
And the sources note a simple, practical reality. Third world countries cannot afford the luxury of Western consumerism. Attempting to emulate those consumption patterns is just unsustainable given their resource constraints and development needs.
This leads to a reflection on values, with the sources highlighting a perceived crisis of human values in the West, despite its immense material prosperity. This raises a thought-provoking potential role for developing countries. Perhaps they can exemplify a blend of material aspirations and spiritual values that could offer lessons for solving global problems beyond just economic growth.
These debates and challenges demonstrate that development is not monolithic. not a single universally applicable blueprint. There are profound disagreements on its causes, goals, methods.
And that complexity is further evident when the sources explore not just the two main camps, but four alternative paths or models of development that have been proposed or attempted, explicitly stating there is no foolproof method.
These four models are the market society model, the welfare state model, the socialist model, and the Ghanaian model. They represent distinct visions for organizing society and pursuing betterment.
Let's break them down. The market society model, as we touched on earlier in the liberal view, equates development directly with modernization and holds Western society as the ideal model to be emulated.
The goal is for developing societies to acquire the characteristics of Western societies. The source cites James S. Coleman's description of a modern society: high urbanization, widespread literacy, high per capita income, extensive mobility, high commercialization, industrialization, extensive mass communication, widespread participation.
So, from this perspective, modernization is essentially synonymous with Westernization. Politically, this means evolving towards liberal democratic structures. Economically, it encourages a highly competitive market structure. Socially, it promotes ideals like equality of opportunity, respect based on merit rather than tradition.
And economic growth is seen as a fundamental prerequisite, a necessary condition for this kind of development. The sources mention stage theories here, like W. Rostow's five-stage model.
Right. Traditional society, preconditions for takeoff, drive to maturity, high mass consumption. And these economic stages are often linked to parallel stages of political development, like A.F.K. Organsky's four stages: primitive unification, industrialization, national welfare, politics of abundance. The core suggestion, as summarized by the source, is straightforward. Developing countries should follow the footsteps of capitalist countries.
But as we heard earlier, this view faces severe criticism within the sources, particularly from Andre Gunder Frank.
Frank is a major critic of this linear, stage-based model. He argues the underdevelopment experienced by Western societies early on was an original traditional state. However, the underdevelopment of contemporary developing societies is fundamentally different. It is a consequence of European capitalist expansion and imperialism.
Different starting points.
Exactly. Since their starting points and historical experiences are radically different, Frank argues, simply following the same pattern won't work.
The source also highlights the significant incompatibility of the market society model with the communitarian spirit often present in developing societies.
While materially poor, many developing cultures traditionally valued social solidarity, compassion, mutual support. The market society model, however, is based fundamentally on competition, individual self-interest, defining obligations primarily by mutual interest. Common interest is often seen merely as the aggregate of individual self-interests.
So adopting this model wholesale, the sources warn, risks weakening that existing social fabric, that sense of community.
That's the concern raised. And the source makes a powerful critique about the potential consequences of prioritizing profit above all else. In a market society driven by maximizing profit, everything higher education, art, culture can become geared towards market needs. Activities promoting intellectual development, human values, friendship, love, devotion. They can be relegated or undervalued because they don't directly contribute to profit maximization.
The source starkly states that in such a system, human beings can be reduced to self-seeking animals, focused purely on material gain. The significant risk highlighted is that societies might increase material welfare, but potentially at the profound expense of their moral strength and social cohesion.
That's a heavy point, a real challenge to the idea that economic growth automatically leads to overall societal betterment.
Moving on, the welfare state model is presented as a modified version of the liberal view.
Yes, it emerged historically within already developed capitalist societies. While its roots go back to figures like Bismarck in Germany in the late 19th century, his state socialism ideas, insurance reforms partly to counter socialism, or Asquith's liberal government in England with the National Insurance Act of 1911.
The concept really found its most influential expression with the famous Beveridge Report in England in 1942. During WWII.
Correct. William Henry Beveridge's report laid out wide-ranging suggestions for a comprehensive social safety net. This included ideas like a free national health service, family allowances, government responsibility for full employment, and universal social insurance providing benefits from the cradle to the grave.
Covering unemployment, sickness, old age pensions, funeral grants, maternity.
The whole gamut. And England's implementation of most of these recommendations after the war made it a leading model of a welfare state. According to the source, a welfare state fundamentally stands for the state actively providing social services to its citizens. Social security, free or subsidized education, public health, poor relief, subsidized essential goods.
Funded primarily through progressive taxation. Higher incomes pay higher rates, redistributing wealth.
That's the mechanism. The goal is to compensate and support those who are helpless or vulnerable within the open market system. The sources note it removed the stigma historically attached to poor relief, reframing it as mutual assistance and self-reliance among citizens to ensure a respectable standard of living for all, covering basic needs, housing, opportunities, employment, living standards.
The model gained significant popularity across Europe, France, Italy, Germany, Sweden, Australia, New Zealand, though less so in the U.S., which kept more faith in the open competitive system.
Right. And for developing countries, the sources see the welfare state model, or at least elements of it, as almost indispensable.
Why indispensable? What's the argument there?
Primarily due to the widespread poverty inherited from their history and a long tradition of social support systems often rooted in family or community. However, urbanization and modernization have eroded these traditional networks, necessitating the state stepping in to assume responsibility for basic welfare provision.
But there are clear limitations for developing countries trying to implement this model fully.
Absolutely. The most significant is often an extreme shortage of resources. This means welfare programs operate on a subdued scale compared to wealthy nations, sometimes relying on foreign assistance. Furthermore, widespread bureaucratic inefficiency and corruption in many developing countries can severely undermine the effective functioning and reach of these programs, ensuring they don't always benefit the intended recipients.
Moving to the third model, the socialist model, which the source divides into two broad streams.
Yes, revolutionary socialism and evolutionary socialism. Revolutionary socialism is rooted in Marx, Engels, Lenin. Based on belief in inherent class struggle, advocates for a revolutionary method to overthrow capitalism, leading to full-scale socialization of the major means of production, state ownership, and control.
The source points to historical examples, like the former USSR from 1917 and various other countries, but also notes the significant shift after the Soviet bloc dissolved in 1991, when most countries following this path relinquished it. It mentions Albania, Yugoslavia, Mongolia, South Yemen, among third-world countries that tried and abandoned it.
While some countries still retain elements, China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, often in less rigid forms, the source notes its strengths included protecting worker interests, prioritizing social and economic rights, achieving near-universal employment, education, healthcare access.
But the major weakness highlighted is the almost total disregard or suppression of civil liberties and political rights.
Yeah, that's the big trade-off often cited. The second stream is evolutionary socialism, also known as democratic socialism. This approach seeks to achieve socialist objectives, greater social economic equality, welfare provision through democratic means.
So rather than revolution, it's about using the existing political system. Ballots, not bullets.
Essentially, yes. It gives precedence to civil and political rights within a democratic framework, while progressively working towards providing social and economic rights via legislation and a social safety network. Social policy, based on social justice and citizen welfare, becomes a key tool, often used for mass appeal in democratic elections.
The source notes that this evolutionary model essentially converges significantly with the welfare state model we just discussed. Countries like England since the 1940s are seen as examples of both, and India and other third-world countries emulated this approach to varying degrees.
However, its popularity has seen a recent decline, particularly in developing countries like India. The sources attribute this to challenges like huge populations, chronic resource shortages, persistent bureaucratic inefficiency, rampant corruption, all making it increasingly difficult for the state to cope with the demands for subsidies, reservations, extensive welfare provisions promised by this model.
This has led to a noticeable shift in focus in many of these countries towards policies associated with liberalization, privatization, globalization, moving closer to the market-oriented approach. The source notes this transition in India's recent economic trajectory.
And here, the source includes an important caveat, similar to its point about the market model. There's a need to prevent this commercialization and market focus from harming the underlying human value system, that potential valuing of community over pure profit.
Finally, we come to the Gandhian model. The sources present Mahatma Gandhi primarily as a moral philosopher, noting he didn't lay out a specific systematic theory of economic or political development in the academic sense, but his ideas contained profound insights relevant to development.
His core principle was the absolute precedence of morality over politics. He viewed politics not as an end in itself, but as an instrument to achieve moral goals. Even India's independence movement, for Gandhi, was as much about the moral regeneration of the Indian people as it was about gaining political freedom.
He was a strong critic of Western civilization, specifically believing it promoted excessive consumerism, which he felt led to moral decline. He explicitly stated he did not want India to simply emulate the West.
For Gandhi, real moral regeneration required self-control, a spirit of renunciation, not endlessly fulfilling material needs. The sources quote him from Young India in 1927. It's quite striking.
What did he say?
I do not believe that multiplication of wants and machinery contrived to supply them is taking the world a single step nearer its goal. I wholeheartedly detest this mad desire to destroy distance and time, to increase animal appetites and go to the ends of the earth in search of their satisfaction. If modern civilization stands for all this, I call it satanic.
Wow. Powerful words. He was fundamentally against the endless multiplication of material wants, arguing that the real improvement of life is internal, in the conscience, not solely dependent on external material conditions. It's about knowing one's duties and fulfilling them.
He advocated for minimal consumption, consuming only what's strictly necessary to be physically fit and able to serve. Any additional consumption, he argued, was basically grabbing the rightful share of others.
That links directly to another powerful quote attributed to him in the sources. Earth has enough resources to satisfy everybody's need, but not their greed.
Exactly. A greedy person, focused on excessive consumption, harms both nature and society. Self-restraint, on the other hand, benefits oneself, building moral character, and others, leaving resources available. He also put forward the principle of bread labor.
Bread labor, what's that?
Arguing that each individual should perform some form of physical labor to produce their own consumption goods, in addition to their normal duties or intellectual work. It linked manual labor, dignity, self-sufficiency. For India, with its huge workforce, he specifically prioritized production by the masses over mass production by machines.
Enabling large numbers of people to produce goods, often using simpler tools rather than concentrating production in factories.
That was the idea. His reasoning, quoted from Harijan in 1935, argued against pitting dead machinery against the millions of living machines represented by the villagers. He believed machinery should help and ease human effort, but its contemporary use tended to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few, displacing necessary human labor.
Gandhi extended his principle of nonviolence beyond human interactions to include nature. He strongly deprecated actions that degrade the earth, impoverish nature through overexploitation, or create inequity in resource distribution.
He posed the question, how can we be nonviolent to nature unless the ethics of nonviolence become central to the ethos of human culture, linking environmental respect directly to fundamental moral principles?
While stopping industrialization altogether might not be feasible today, as Gandhi might have envisioned, the source notes his approach resonates strongly with advocates of sustainable development.
Definitely. They appreciate his emphasis on curbing consumption, particularly by the wealthy, to prevent overexploitation of finite resources and ensure they are available for both present and future generations. His final point on machinery captures a pragmatic balance. Machinery has its place, it has come to stay, but it must not be allowed to displace necessary human labor. An acknowledgement of technological reality, but tempered by a core humanistic value.
The sources provide a helpful summary table comparing these four models based on criteria like the status of the individual, entitlements, rights, attitude towards industrialization, nature, the goal of development. Looking at that table, you see stark contrasts.
Oh yeah. The market model's autonomous individual versus the socialist Gandhian fully responsible individual, or the indifferent attitude towards nature in the first three models versus the very friendly attitude in the Gandhian model. These models truly highlight the vast spectrum of ideas about what constitutes a good society and how to get there.
Ranging from prioritizing individual liberty and economic growth to emphasizing collective welfare, social equality, moral values, and environmental harmony. And this brings us neatly to a critical dimension that has become increasingly prominent in development discussions: the environment.
Absolutely. The sources acknowledge that while economic development aims primarily to improve human life positive outcomes, it also has significant negative environmental effects. Higher production inherently requires greater exploitation of natural resources.
And the sources point out that in the modern era, with gigantic machines, vast energy demands, ever-growing consumption globally, this exploitation has accelerated dramatically compared to earlier historical periods.
This rapid acceleration has forced a series of urgent questions onto the development agenda. Can this rate of exploitation continue indefinitely? Are natural resources truly unlimited? What are the long-term ill effects on the environment? And crucially, what concrete actions are needed to prevent environmental disaster?
These pressing questions, the sources state, are what galvanized the champions of sustainable development.
hmm And the concept of sustainable development itself was most famously defined in the Brundtland Report, officially titled Our Common Future, published back in 1987.
A landmark report.
Definitely. It explicitly recognized that natural resources, upon which all development depends, are not inexhaustible. Its definition of sustainable development is now widely quoted. It is a development process that should meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs.
The idea had been floated earlier, right?
Right.
Stockholm Earth Summit in '72 raised awareness about depleting resources. But Brundtland really endorsed it, gave it a clear definition, gave the global conversation a new direction.
And the sources emphasize the prominence given to the word needs in the Brundtland definition. This wasn't accidental. It reflected a deliberate effort to integrate the environmental concern with the pressing human concern to eradicate poverty, to meet the basic needs of the vast majority of humanity, particularly in the developing world, who were seen as the most vulnerable to both poverty and environmental degradation.
So the core goal is to promote economic and social development, lifting people out of poverty, improving lives, but doing so without causing environmental degradation, overexploiting finite resources, or causing pollution that harms ecosystems and human health.
And this focus on blending environmental protection with development was particularly welcomed by developing countries and by groups specifically concerned about poverty and social deprivation, seeing it as a way to pursue necessary growth responsibly. The debate around sustainable development, the sources note, remains a central theme for champions of environmentalism.
Which leads us directly to environmentalism or ecologism itself, described by the source as a natural corollary of sustainable development. It goes beyond just managing resources sustainably. It calls for a fundamental redefinition of the relationship between human beings and nature.
It proposes that humans should view themselves as partners with nature and other living organisms, not as masters entitled to exploit without limit. It also implies a need for significant changes in human organization and behavior. Sources draw a contrast between early human civilization and the modern era.
In early civilization, small populations, simple lifestyles, close to nature, limited needs, small production, natural replenishment.
Right. Contrast that with the modern era. Multiplied populations, constantly rising consumption demands, superior technology enabling large-scale exploitation, rapidly depleting natural stocks, reliance on artificial goods, widespread contamination of ecosystems. The sources argued there's a dire need to restore equilibrium between human activity and the natural world.
Early environmentalist thought, hinting at this critique, is seen in E.F. Schumacher's influential 1973 book, Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered, a powerful critique of the scale and methods of modern industrial society.
Schumacher observed that the modern industrial system, in its relentless pursuit of growth, consumes the very basis on which it has been erected. That was a profound insight that the foundation of seemingly prosperous industrial society was being eroded by the very processes that built it.
He used a vivid analogy, warning against confusing natural resources, things like fossil fuels, minerals, forests, clean water, which cannot be created or easily increased by humans with capital.
Right. He argued that industrial society was treating these non-renewable natural resources as if they were income or interest from capital, when in fact they were the capital itself. By consuming this fundamental natural capital, industrial society was, in his words, digging its own grave.
The sources explicitly point out that advanced industrial societies, due to their vastly higher rates of production and consumption compared to developing nations, bear a disproportionate responsibility for current environmental degradation and pollution. Ted Trainor's stark statistic from 1985 is used.
Yeah, the U.S. versus Ethiopian energy use, 617 times as much per person.
That scale is truly staggering, highlights the vast resource inequality. The sources provide further U.S. consumption data. Americans 6% of world pop, consuming roughly 50% of manufactured goods, 33% of energy at the time. Leaves little per capita for poorer countries. The sources even add this level of consumption isn't good for Americans' health either.
Hmm. Linking environmental issues to well-being in developed nations, too. Given this analysis, environmentalist suggestions for action, as presented in the sources, often involve significant lifestyle changes, particularly in developed countries. Reducing private vehicle use, favoring public transport bicycles,
Shifting towards plant-based diets instead of resource-intensive meat.
promoting wind solar over coal nuclear, large-scale tree planting. These ideas have genuinely motivated changes in individual and collective behavior through the environmental movement. The fundamental goal of environmentalism, according to the source, is maintaining friendly relations with nature, avoiding damage. This philosophy gives rise to green movement, green politics.
The sources argue that the blind race for material resources and growth in the name of conventional development leads to a profound alienation of humans from nature, affecting us physically and spiritually. Restoring a harmonious, nonviolent relationship requires humility, respect towards nature and other species, recognizing our interdependence.
The relentless extraction of resources, fueling a manufacturing system driven by greedy consumption, directly causes environmental degradation and, ultimately, harms humanity itself. The sources link various pollutants to damage to human health and major global environmental problems.
They define these problems clearly. The greenhouse effect, increased earth temp due to CO2 water vapor trapping heat. Infrared heat absorbed, surface temps rise, polar ice melts.
Global warming. The extraordinary rise in Earth's temp, primarily attributed to increasing atmospheric pollution from petrol diesel consumption, soil erosion from deforestation, feared to cause climate change, accelerate polar ice melt, rising sea levels.
And ozone depletion. The thinning of the ozone layer, 10-50 kilometers up, which absorbs harmful UV radiation. Pollution caused depletion, notably the hole over Antarctica, reducing the protective shield for life on Earth.
The environmentalist solution for society, as presented in the sources, is quite radical. Dismantle the current large-scale industrial system.
Really? Dismantle it.
Yes, and replace it with smaller-scale manufacturing and economic activity organized by self-governing local communities. This is the practical application of Schumacher's human scale, where small is beautiful. Decentralized, community-controlled economic activity, less damaging to the environment, more responsive to human needs locally.
They also advocate for curbing overall consumption globally and often call for population reduction, although the sources add nuance here. While acknowledging the sheer number of people in the third world as a source of problems, they also point out their per capita consumption is very low compared to the West, and their large populations are also potential labor power.
Right. The high consumption and population growth in Western countries also need control. Finally, the sources emphasize that moral regeneration is considered essential for achieving a just and equitable distribution of resources globally and nationally. Individual responsibility for a clean, congenial atmosphere is highlighted.
The sources share some inspiring slogans that encapsulate this spirit. One from the UN is particularly poignant. We have not inherited this earth from our forefathers. We have borrowed it from our children.
That powerfully conveys intergenerational responsibility, doesn't it? Stewardship, temporary guardianship, not outright ownership.
Another is the environmentalist call. Think globally, act locally. Encouraging individuals and communities to organize and act locally while remaining conscious of global effects. Global problems require widespread local efforts.
And the British-German environmentalist slogan, neither left nor right, but forwards, suggesting environmental concerns should transcend traditional ideological divides, urging people to unite for common action towards a sustainable future.
These ideas show environmentalism isn't just about protecting nature for its own sake, but fundamentally rethinking human society, consumption, our relationship with the planet, all in the context of pursuing a truly sustainable form of development.
Beyond the economic and environmental aspects, many scholars, as noted in the sources, feel that overall development also requires a fundamental transformation of the political environment and its institutions.
This brings us to the concept of political development, defined as the process by which a developing country's political system acquires characteristics typically found in developed countries.
And similar to the market society model for economic development, the model often implicitly or explicitly referenced here is that of Western liberal democracy. This process is sometimes called political modernization.
So modernization in this political sense means transitioning from traditional values and institutions, maybe agrarian societies, traditional authority, to modern ways of organizing political life. Systems deemed more suitable for industrial, technologically advanced societies, capable of fulfilling modern needs.
That's the idea. The sources present two important models that elaborate on what this political development or modernization entails. First is by James S. Coleman and Lucian Pye, who saw political development as political modernization.
They viewed a modern political system as being more efficient, like comparing modern industry to traditional agriculture, optimizing the political machinery to process demands and govern effectively.
They contrasted the limited functions of a traditional political system, tax, lord, defense, with the expanded role of a modern political system, which takes on an active function in improving quality of life, in addition to those conventional tasks.
And they highlighted the shift in the relationship between state and people. Traditional systems, people uninvolved, government power over them. Modern systems, citizens closely associated, communicating demands, opinions, expressing support, opposition. Government authority relies on legitimacy.
Coleman and Pye identified a development syndrome characterized by three key aspects of political modernization: differentiation, equality, and capacity. Differentiation, as we touched on earlier, is the progressive separation and specialization of roles, institutions, spheres, admin distinct from political leadership, legal systems independent from religious authority.
Equality is seen as the fundamental ethos of modernity in the political sphere. Universal adult citizenship, legal equality, promoting psychic equality of opportunity status based on merit achievement, not birth tradition. Transition from subjects to citizens. Participation encouraged, increases respect for rule of law.
And capacity refers to the increased ability of the political system to effectively manage public affairs, resolve internal disputes peacefully, cope with the increasing and diversifying demands of a modernizing society.
The second important model comes from Gabriel Almond and G.B. Powell. Using structural and functional analysis, they also identified three core characteristics of political development.
Their first is structural differentiation. Similar to Coleman and Pye's concept, but framed in terms of evolving distinct structure organs for specific political functions. At the input level, socialization, interest articulation, aggregation, communication, and output level, separation of powers, rulemaking, application, adjudication.
Their second characteristic is secularization of culture, a shift in political culture where people adopt a more rational, empirical, analytical outlook towards politics. Transition from lower to higher political culture.
And understanding political culture is key here. The source references Almond and Verba's The Civic Culture, categorizing political cultures based on awareness attitude: parochial, low awareness; subject, aware of government output but passive; and participant, active, respects authority but independent, believes in influencing the system. A move towards participant culture is seen as crucial.
And the third characteristic in Almond and Powell's model is the expansion of capabilities, an increase in the political system's ability to perform functions. Four types identified.
Regulative capability, legitimate coercion control; extractive capability, appropriating resources like taxes; distributive capability, distributing benefit services; and responsive capability, responding effectively to demands. Almond and Powell stress balanced development needs regulative extractive matched with distributive responsive. A system that takes must also give and listen.
The implication of both these models is that if developing societies successfully adopt these characteristics, differentiation, equality, capacity, specialization, secularization, expanded capabilities, their political systems are likely to become more efficient, stable, developed.
However, the source concludes this section with a crucial caveat. Echoing earlier critiques of just emulating Western models, it states each country must combine these requisites with its own genius. Developing countries, often large, complex, multicultural, with communitarian heritages, should not be reduced to competitive market societies in the name of their political development.
That's a vital point. Simply adopting structures might not be enough, might even be detrimental if they clash with the society's own values and context. This leads us to concepts closely related to political development, seen as particularly important for new nations: nation building and state building.
The sources describe these as complementary processes. They strengthen each other and ideally must be undertaken together. Fundamental tasks for any new state, especially those emerging from colonial rule.
The core problem faced by most new nations was political integration. Populations often diverse conglomerations of different racial, tribal, ethnic, religious, regional groups. Stronger loyalties often to their immediate community than the abstract state. People needed to develop a sense of belonging to a single nation, transferring primary loyalty to one central power center.
Nation building is the process aimed at achieving this, developing a sense of common identity and community among people within the state's jurisdiction. It provides a sense of identification, a common object of allegiance, an emotional bond, social solidarity that cuts across those narrower group loyalties: religion, race, caste, language, region, culture, occupation.
The goal of nation building is to integrate these diverse sectors, creating a shared national identity. This integration is crucial for consensus, cooperation, domestic peace, political stability, effective governance. It also involves developing the concept of the legitimacy of the nation-state as the central political system in people's minds.
State building is the process that complements and completes nation building. While nation building creates shared identity and legitimacy, state building focuses on creating the necessary infrastructure of power and authority. It implies evolving a common, effective center of power capable of establishing and maintaining law and order throughout the entire territory.
And extending the state's reach and capacity.
Yeah.
Building the bureaucracy, judiciary, police.
Exactly. Building the administrative, judicial, coercive apparatus necessary to enforce laws, collect revenue, extend defensive and welfare services to every part of the territory, all citizens. Respect for authority depends on the state being capable of performing these functions effectively and equitably.
The sources include a specific perspective on this from the eminent Indian political scientist Rajni Kothari, writing in 1976.
Kothari drew a significant distinction. State-nation building he saw as the political aspect of development. Modernization, on the other hand, as the economic, technological, administrative aspects.
He critiqued the prevalent Western view, which tended to focus heavily on modernization metrics, GNP growth, urbanization, bureaucracy, technology, social mobilization, assuming political development, including state and nation building, would somehow follow automatically from these economic and social changes.
Kothari argued forcefully that this assumption is not corroborated by European history. He pointed out that European countries that successfully modernized and industrialized had, for the most part, achieved significant national consolidation and state capacity building before embarking on large-scale modernization. They built unified nations and strong states first.
Therefore, Kothari's suggestion for developing countries was a direct challenge to the conventional wisdom. He argued they should give precedence to state building and nation building, focusing on creating a unified nation and an effective state apparatus before undertaking ambitious economic and technological modernization programs.
This turns the common Western-centric prescription on its head. It suggests building a cohesive political community and a capable state infrastructure isn't just a desirable outcome of development, but a necessary foundation, a prerequisite for successful, stable economic and social modernization. Without that political foundation, modernization efforts might be fragile, exacerbating internal divisions rather than fostering equitable progress.
Wow, that is a powerful argument. And brings together so many threads we've discussed. We've truly covered a vast amount of ground in this deep dive.
We really have. We started by digging into the fundamental concept of development itself, tracing its modern origins, distinguishing it from progress, highlighting the role of conscious goals, empirical measurement alongside value judgments.
We then explored the historical context of the Third World, understand the common characteristics, shared experiences, colonial history, underdevelopment, instability, and looked at the origins of that significant term.
This led us into the great debates, the contrasting liberal view, stages of growth, integration, versus the Marxist dependency view, underdevelopment via exploitation, advocating delinking.
We then examined 4 distinct alternative models: market society, welfare state, socialist, Gandhian, each offering a unique vision, prioritizing profit, security, equality, or moral environmental harmony, and noting their critiques.
Crucially, we integrated the vital link between development and environment, understanding sustainable development, meeting present needs without compromising the future, exploring environmentalism's call to redefine humanity's relationship with nature.
And finally, we delved into the political dimensions. Models of political modernization, the essential processes of nation building and state building, culminating in Rajni Kothari's compelling argument for prioritizing political consolidation before economic modernization.
This deep dive into your sources provides, I hope, a comprehensive framework for understanding the multifaceted idea of development. It's not just economics, but history, power, values, environment, politics, all the forces and philosophies shaping global discussions about how societies change and improve.
It's clear there are many perspectives, profound disagreements, significant internal and external challenges involved. To leave you with a thought from the material to consider further, think about Rajni Kothari's challenge to the conventional Western model. He argued developing countries should prioritize building a united nation and effective state before focusing primarily on economic modernization.
What does that perspective imply for sequencing development efforts today? Is national cohesion and strong state capacity a necessary foundation upon which sustainable economic and social development must be built? Or can economic and political development proceed effectively, perhaps even reinforcing each other simultaneously?
Or perhaps consider the tension we saw running through the models. The market society's strong focus on profit and individual self-interest versus the emphasis on communitarian values, social solidarity, moral considerations in models like the welfare state, socialism, and particularly the Gandhian approach. Can these seemingly opposing approaches ever truly be blended successfully in the pursuit of development that genuinely benefits all members of society and respects the planet?
These complex questions, deeply embedded within the source material you've shared, highlight the ongoing debates about the best, most ethical, most effective paths forward for societies striving for a better future, for their people and the planet.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.